Hi, everyone. We've reached the end of the month, so we're going to recap some of the great conversations that have been going on in the humanizing work community.
If you've had a busy month and haven't been able to stay as engaged with the community as you'd like, this recap will serve as a quick highlight reel. We've dropped links to the original conversations below so you can go deeper on any topics that spark your interest.
Here are the highlights for April 2022. Our first Friday was our conference alumni community, and the session was called an it was easier to say at the time, integral approach to humanizing work. And in this session, Peter shared a draft of a keynote that he's been invited to give at the World Trade Promotion Organization's conference in Accra, Ghana in May. Then we walked through the critical response process to obtain feedback from the community in a structured format to inform the next iteration of his keynote.
Now, stepping back, there was a meta thing that I was doing here, and it might be useful to give you some insight into that. I have a history of procrastinating to the very last minute when I'm giving a big talk. Part of it's just nervousness about getting it right and putting it off because it's a big thing to do. And part of it is just I feel like I'm going to know the most later. And so I have a hard time getting started on these. And so for this talk, knowing that it was a big keynote and it was an audience I hadn't really addressed before, I wanted to sort of hack that a little bit. And so what I did was I scheduled 3 different iterations of this talk. One with the conference alumni community, so that I had to get on it sooner and so that I had more chances to iterate. So I did it here with the conference alumni community. I gave a version of the talk at Adam Weisbart's Agile Virtual Summit. And then we've shot a video of the talk where Richard and I talk a little bit about the model and where it came from and our different responses to that model. So if you too are a procrastinator, then this might be a useful tool for you. Tricia will just cover her ears when she hears me describing this, but if you procrastinate a little bit on a big thing, this might be a useful tool for you. Force yourself into a structure. Force is probably the wrong word, but create a structure for yourself to iterate on the thing so that you get your procrastinating done early, and then you procrastinate on the next draft, but you get it done and you actually get a chance to iterate on it.
We were really excited when Peter was invited to give this keynote speech. It was just exciting to have the opportunity to see humanizing work ideas getting to a broader audience. But it was also really encouraging and really exciting to see our community get excited by this opportunity as well.
And in this session, using the critical response process as a way to get feedback on a work product was also a really interesting experiment. So this one is a good session to revisit if you weren't there on a couple levels. The process we used to share and get feedback on a thing, and then, of course, the content of the keynote itself. So check it out.
All right, next up was our Scrum Master community, and the topic this month was approaching back to the office.
In our community of practice sessions, we do a couple of different types of session meetings. Sometimes we teach a thing, and sometimes we do a let's figure this out together kind of session. And we find that both are great because of the participation of all those in the community.
And so this was one of those let's figure it out together. So we did kind of a focused conversation approach around back to office and what's going on. A few of the key points that come out in this one. First, hybrid seems to be the new default for many organizations. Like, people are going back into the office, but it's definitely not everybody full time. And so that creates a new reality to deal with. We also saw that there were some conflicts, like leaders pushing for in-person, where teams were not as excited about it. Some team members preferring to stay remote, but kind of a mix. And then we talked a bit about a potential trust problem. If people aren't in person, can I trust that they're doing good work? And, what's my role as a leader in monitoring and managing and all those things when people are out of the office?
There was also an interesting moment in this where we talked about our own hypotheses around in-person versus remote versus hybrid. And the idea came up that, what if we just scrapped the assumption that in-person was necessarily better? And I think that's an assumption that many of us hold. And if we were to scrap that assumption, or at least test it, how could we test other hypotheses? We experienced this when we moved to remote training at the start of the pandemic, where we had a strong hypothesis about in-person training, and we learned some interesting things about some of the benefits of doing it the other way. And we were wondering how that experience might help us to do some better testing of different hypotheses about in-person work.
In this one, the group captured a ton of practical tips for making hybrid work, which has always been the hardest. We've got remote figured out reasonably well at this point. We've been doing in person for, human history. But hybrid is a different kind of challenge, and I was thrilled with how many ideas the group came up with. And since so many people are facing this challenge right now, in addition to the content in the video recording of the session, we're capturing a summary of these themes and suggestions and putting those on our website. So follow the link in the show notes for that.
All right. The next community is our product owner community. And this time we decided to do a remote version of one of our favorite innovation games called Product Box, which I've done in person many, many, many times. And we've kind of wondered, how might this work if we were doing it remote?
And turns out it works great, or can work great. Peter made a lovely Miro template for this. We discovered that how you frame the product box is critical, and I don't think we did that as well as we would if we tried it again. And that led to, I think, a little bit of swirling with participants trying to figure out what they were making a box for. But Product Box is great because if you're facilitating one of these with your customers, you get to hear what customers focus on and the language they use to describe a future influenced by your product. And so that's one that I think we would run again on a real thing because it proved to be useful.
Our last community of practice session was for our leadership community, and we talked about addressing polarization in your organization, in your team, and in you. During this session, we shared a model called Polarity Coaching, which is based on Kathy Anderson's book by the same name. And we took the time to work through a few examples, like logical versus intuitive decision-making and remote versus in-person. It was really interesting to hear some feedback from our participants. I remember somebody saying, this was so good because it was so hard. Help them build empathy, not just for themselves as they were struggling through this, but empathy for team members that they planned to work through this with back at the office.
Yeah, and the core of this model is that we can gravitate to one side based on our preferences. And whatever our preference in any of those polarities is, we tend to focus on the benefits of our side and the drawbacks of the side we don't. And so the model invites us to acknowledge that both sides probably have some benefits and some drawbacks. And then it provides us a structure to get to some clear steps to take to move forward.
I recommend checking out the recording on this one and especially sticking around until the end because the meta-level reflections on the model in the last 10 minutes were really valuable. Existing community members can access links to all these recordings on the community space. Our communities are made up of alumni of our courses and our annual conference. So if that's you, and if you want to get in on the discussions as they happen, reach out and we'll get you the info to register.